Platemark is a podcast about prints and the printmaking ecosystem. In every episode, we'll hear from people who work in various roles in that ecosystem. I'm your host, Ann Schaefer. I work to promote prints and printmaking through this pod, also through organizing fine art print fairs across the country, and also organizing exhibitions, albeit intermittently. The goal of the pod is to demystify the world of prints and printmaking, which can be technically challenging, and to demonstrate the range of opportunities in this charming corner of the art world. This is a show that takes you behind the scenes to expose the generous, collaborative, and creative people working to better the world one print at a time. Today's guest is Jonathan Thomas. Jonathan is the head of the printmaking department at MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art, and he is primarily an etcher, although he works occasionally in screen printing. I got Jonathan to take us on a walk through the process of printing in plaster, which is something that etchers have done over time in order to test a plate and see how the progress is going when they had no access to a press. But I've always been confused about how in the world you pop a plate off of some plaster without dinging it pretty badly. So he's going to tell us the answers to that. We talk about his multi-plate color works, which are unbelievably gorgeous. And we also talk about the narrative trajectory in those prints. We also talk about the critical role of experiential learning in the undergraduate setting, well, graduate as well. And we talk about MICA's Dolphin press. And at the end, we get into a kind of a deep discussion about the critique process in art education and how in the world you go about it, which is something you know I've talked about before. All right, let's see. Housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Images that we talk about are over on the podcast website, platemarkpodcast.com. You'll find them over there. There's also a support and donate button. You can hit the button and help me keep the lights on. I'd appreciate it. All right, I think that's it. Let's get rolling. Jonathan, it is wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course. You are from my local school. You're from MICA, and I figured it was time to talk to somebody from down the street instead of somebody from a far-flung place. So here you are. Introduce yourself, everybody.
Sure. I'm Jonathan Thomas. I am an artist and teacher living in Baltimore, and I work at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and I chair the printmaking program here and work with a really spectacular team of other artists and teachers and a great staff, and we have a really big robust printmaking program here. And Anne, you visited us many, many times.
I have.
And we've got some great teachers here and really proud to be a part of this program. And I've got a studio here in Baltimore that's just about a mile from the school. So I've got a pretty good situation between where I live, where I work as an artist, and then where I teach. And yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I think people forget about Baltimore, in our string of East Coast cities. And the truth is it's, still pretty. You can do it. You can afford to live here, I think it's pretty special that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first moved up here from Miami, part of my thinking was, so I was working down in Miami and I was fortunate enough to have this possibility of coming up to MICA. My original intent was to go to New York and commute in because a lot of MICA faculty did that.
Right.
And at the time I made that move, I had my two close friends, including the studio where I shared, they were moving to New York. A couple other friends were going out to LA. So there's this little bit of an exodus from Miami at the time. So I thought that's what I would do. But once I got here, I realized that wasn't the right thing. Wasn't the right thing for me personally in terms of my engagement with MICA and the city. But it also wasn't right practically for the studio space, which was another reason why I made that transition, was to develop a really fully operational studio so I could do everything I wanted to do. So that said, Baltimore has been, it's not super easy, of course, but Baltimore has been a good place to figure out that type of balance.
I've been to your studio, and I think you inherited the studio from Brian Garner, didn't you?
I sure did, yeah.
Okay. Hi, Brian.
Yeah. And it's so funny because, Brian, how well do you know Brian?
Well, he was here when I first got here
Yeah,
teaching,
okay.
so yeah.
I mean, he kept that studio immaculate,
Yes.
and that's part of it's part of Brian. A very precise person and an excellent printer, of course. And that studio is not immaculate anymore. I mean, not that it's that crazy messy, but I'm definitely a little bit of organized chaos in my space. And yeah, I don't think Brian's been back into that studio, but if he did, I don't know if he'd recognize it very well. So,
He'd be fine, I'm sure.
yeah.
I've asked Brian to come on, and I need to circle back to him because
Yeah.
it'd be nice to talk to him. Anyway, so conventional wisdom in the podverse is to jump right in. And the burning thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think everybody will be super interested in it, is printing in plaster.
Yes.
Can you walk us through it?
I will do my best. Maybe the first thing I would say about printing in plaster is that I've printed in plaster periodically over the course of my time making prints. But I actually learned this as a thing to do from who is David Faber. Do you know David Faber by chance?
Do not.
Oh my gosh, David is such an extraordinary artist. He's a longtime professor at Wake Forest, still teaching, although he must be pretty close to retirement now. Next time you come to MICA, I have several of David's pieces that I was able to acquire from working with him. I'll show you some of his work. He's such a great artist. He was such a great artist for me to learn from as an undergrad. And yeah, I still think about his work all the time. But one of the things that he did was make some plaster cast prints. And he did it in a particular style that I think he collaged on the prints as well. So it was a little bit difficult to decipher what was printed and what was collaged, but they were like objects. And he put them into plexiglass boxes even as an object. And that was just one of the things that he did. And so at some point, he taught us that as undergraduate students. I don't remember what I made. I don't remember thinking about it a whole lot back then. But I remember every once in a while trying it when I had the space and time to do it. And forever, I've been like, wow, I really want to investigate this. I really want to get into this. I've had this tendency for a while, this need for a while to complement so much of the work that I do just on paper, whether it's drawing or printing. But I've often thought about the relationship between what I'm doing on paper and some of my tendencies to make something more object oriented or more 3D. I mean, I'm not a sculptor whatsoever, and I've never really presented anything in 3D, but some of my prints I've started to think of more as objects. And of course, that plaster material as a substrate really starts to, of course, play into that. So I finally had some time this past summer to really kind of dig into it much more and do some testing. And so, do you want me to just go through the basics of the process?
Well, yeah, but first we should say that you usually are in intaglio land. So we're talking about printing intaglio plates, but also we just wanted to mention that the reason I'm so hyped up about it is because they were doing plaster prints at the Atelier, at Atelier 17. And the thing that I have always assumed about it was that it was a method. I mean, I'm sure they love the dimensionality, but it was a method that you could do a test run on one of your plates if you didn't have a press.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So there's so many different aspects to it. For sure, there's the sculptural aspect, the object aspect, but there's the accessibility aspect as well. If you don't have an expensive press or some way of exerting a ton of pressure, the plaster process is a chemical process that will transfer material from one surface to another without that physical pressure. And it's pretty marvelous. I mean, it's pretty magical. And
they look amazing.
Yeah, it's
the quality's just different.
The plaster material, it just has a surface. It's such a unique. I mean, you can use different types of plaster, but it's such a unique kind of white surface and has such a unique texture. It's different than looking at the paper for sure. It's something else. And if you have some degree of familiarity, I think, with etchings, and you look closely at some plaster pieces, yeah, there's just something peculiar about it that is striking. It does take looking at it in person. It's a little tough to see through a screen, and maybe, tough to see for someone that doesn't have some familiarity with etchings in general. But if you have some familiarity and you're able to see them in person, yeah, it's really quite special. So, and I've always known that. And so that's why I was like, oh, I need to spend time doing this. I need to spend time doing this. Because the other issue is that it's technically a little tricky.
Ah.
Yeah. So,
all right, give it to us.
well, without getting too technical, I shouldn't say that exactly. That there's two sides to that statement. It's pretty simple to just do it. It's hard to do it well.
Okay.
I guess. So here's what I would say about the research that I've done with plaster, with my work. What I was trying to accomplish was something that I think I haven't seen in other examples of plaster work. And as far as I know, Anne, it was invented at the workshop at Atelier 17.
That wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not sure that's actually true.
Okay.
Likely, yeah certainly
all right.
likely.
Little tough to find history. That's like one of the first references to the process.
Okay.
What I haven't really seen is really, really precise transfers, like really good, rich transfers in plaster. Like it's easy to get a transfer. It's easy to get some lines. It's easy to get some information. But what's really challenging is to get really precise transfers through the process. Now, when you get it, it's really marvelous. So I think one of the things I was exploring was just figuring out the right mixtures of plaster, figuring out the timing, figuring out the inking systems for the plates. These are intaglio plates. And just kind of getting all that down so that the success rate of the transfers was pretty high, like better than 50% is basically what I was shooting for. But yeah.
But when you say the transfer, do you mean like the consistency of the inked lines? Things aren't pulling out in the same way, or
yeah,
what do you
exactly.
mean?
I mean, just like on a press, when you're working with intaglio, you're inking the plate in a particular way, and then you're using a particular paper and you're using a particular pressure to get a certain result in the transfer. Part of the artistry of that is controlling that transfer. And I mean, there's artists that explicitly transfer ink in a way that's actually not 100%, based on how they ink it. They're using lighter pressure, or the way that they're inking it in such a way is not 100% of the information that's actually there. I mean, most of the time that's the goal, but not all the time. I have this thing all the time with my students. They'll take a really good impression of one of their etchings, and we'll be looking at it and analyzing it. And I'll be like, okay, let's go print this together again. And then we'll go print it again together. And then we'll compare their impression with the new impression. And it'll be just a slight adjustment with the ink and a slight adjustment with the pressure, and maybe a slight adjustment with the blankets or something like that on the press. And then they'll have a much richer print. And you would never know it. Like if you just looked at the first print, it would be fine. It'd be a nice image, but there's more there. And I mean, that's part of the magic of printmaking, of course, working with an intermediary, working with that material that transfers something. There's always residue left on that source, always, even when you have as much of a transfer as possible. And, then you take that away. And so that print is always just this recording. It's always just that memory of that moment. There are slight variations in there that, as you get better at printing and working, you can really, really control. So it's no different than thinking about all the different decision makings you have on the press. It's just the same thing with the plaster material. And there just isn't that history of people doing it a lot to know, like, what do I do here? How do I adjust this hydrocal? What percentage of plaster should I use to water? And what's the timing of it? But if you get all those things right, it really, through that process of casting that plate, it'll suck that ink off of that plate right into the plaster and just sit right there on the surface and have a real emanation to it. Really glows.
Do you get the ridges, the line ridges?
Yeah, you'll get some physicality, and I feel like you see that in some of the examples that exist more so than in my pieces, because all my plates are very shallow. So a lot of these works that we're talking about are heavily aquatint works. Aquatint is really my love in terms of the intaglio medium. And so transferring all the richness of aquatint into the plaster was the goal. And especially a lot of these new works that I'm doing, there really is this really full range of value. I'm trying to create a dramatic light and dark quality in the pieces. The lighting of the work is really important. So getting all that mixed into the plaster just adds this other element.
My next question is, how do you separate the plate from the plaster? I mean, how wet is, where in, I don't understand.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's actually, that part of it is actually not too challenging. I'll just go through the real basics of it. You just ink your plate up like you typically would, except you maybe leave a little bit more oil on the plate, a little bit more ink on the plate. And that's because the reason why this works so well with intaglio, you can do it with other things, but the reason why it works so well with intaglio is because of plate tone. There's a little layer of oil on the surface of a plate, even the negative space. You can control that, but that's something that quite naturally happens when wiping down an intaglio plate. And that just allows for the release.
Oh.
So you have all the oil of the ink in all the lines and all the textures, but there's also a little plate tone that,
my head's exploding, Jonathan.
Goes over the entire plate.
It's so simple.
But that said, I don't do it enough, but I do love mold making and casting objects and those things. That's very interesting space for me. And I hope to at one point explore that more in my life, but it's not that different than that. You're just creating a release, but the material is the actual ink. So you ink up your plate, maybe leave a little bit more plate tone on there, a little bit more oil on there. And so you have this plate and you literally build out a frame of some type, which can be sophisticated. Like you could, very carefully create some kind of a structure around the plate, or it could be as simple as putting down some clay or putting down a pre-existing frame that you might have. Yeah, you create that control mechanism. You pour that plaster on top of the plate. You literally just pour it right on top of the plate. And you let it set on the plate. And that plaster, of course, it heats up as it starts to cure, as it starts to set. And that's when you know it's working. And you just time it so that you don't leave it too long and you don't cut it too early. There's like a sweet spot. And the plaster takes maybe, let's just say half an hour, 45 minutes. You pop off the mold, the frame, and you can flip it over. And the plate is embedded into the plaster. And so the question that you're asking is, how do you get that plate off? And you do have to carefully pick at the edges, but it will, in a relatively simple way, pop off. So that's not one of the harder parts of it, but it's a good question because you would think it would just get swallowed up into the whole thing.
Or you would ding the plate mark.
Yeah. Oh, you can do that.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
That does happen.
Can't fix that.
Yeah, that does happen. But of course, in some of the plaster cast pieces that I've seen, of course, they're digging back into the plaster. They're really turning it into like something physical and something very like a relief sculpture. And I don't do a lot of that, but I do curate at least a little bit the edge. And so if I did ding an edge as I was pulling the plate off, I would adjust it and try to kind of sand it out. And yeah, so super fun process. And so when I was doing this, the bulk of the work this summer, I just set up the studio as a little bit of a manufacturing zone where I had 4 or 5 different molds in a row, and I was able to have 3 or 4 going at a time. So I wasn't waiting like an hour before I would know whether I screwed up or not. And which did happen a lot.
But the other thing I know, because I have seen a couple of your things in plaster, they're not very thick. The ones from the atelier that you find on the market are at least an inch, if not 2.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things, though, that it's like, well, I don't know any better. So that's the way it is. And once again, it's because there's not a lot of these that exist. There's not a lot of these out there. I've seen a couple of artists use plaster recently, and it's like, oh, that's awesome. That's great. They're making transfers in plaster. There's not a lot of examples out there. So I did these as thinner, the objects that I've been working with, the plates are relatively small, but I wanted the plaster. When I first was doing the casting, I was doing the casting pretty tight to the plate, but I wanted that plaster to be a part of the piece. I wanted that object to be a tablet.
Mm.
I wanted that surface to be really present. I wanted that margin to play a role in especially with the imagery that I was working with. I wanted that margin in that space to really frame out the intensity of the illusion of the etching with that subtle color and texture of the surface. And so I really tried to spread out that plaster. And so they were like, I guess 14 by 16 or something, which isn't crazy large, but they were 6 by 8 plates mostly. And so in terms of just the volume of plaster and the weight of the material, it was better if they were thinner. And I would get cracking. That's one of the problems, of course. I'm going to get into casting stuff, but you can prevent the cracking by embedding some wire in there and some netting in the back, and there's different strategies for preventing that from happening.
I've always thought of those meshes that you stick in the back as the hanging mechanism, but not a stabilizer. Interesting.
Yeah, you can use it as a stabilizer too.
Huh.
But
cool.
I've done a little bit of it, but not a ton. Like the pieces that you've seen don't actually have that in there. When you do use those and you apply it correctly, it really does help with cracking issues and stuff like that. That's really the main issue with the larger pieces. It'll look fine after an hour, but you'll come back the next day and there'll be a crack.
Oh.
Yeah. It happens.
Oh,
and so it's a real, it's not great, because you might, like I said, like you think you get the right impression. You get all that transfer, all that ink. It's a beautiful recording of that etching. You maybe get 2 out of 5 or 2 out of 6 or something, and you come in the next day and one of them's cracked just from the curing. So yeah, it's a little bit of a labor, but I think for me so far, like totally worth it. And I think I'm just really beginning with it. I really hope to utilize it a lot more. I like what is happening so far with it. My last thing I would say is Rebecca Gilbert and I, Rebecca's a wonderful artist. We did a Plastercast demo once for a conference, and we did put together a nice pamphlet that describes the process. And I am, of course, completely would love to share that with anyone who wants it.
Cool.
It was very popular at the conference when we did that.
I bet.
Because of the reason that you first described. It's a way to work with intaglio or etching without having a press.
And they just are plain old lovely.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've hit the big nugget, we can move on. So I always, the first thing I usually ask is, when did you figure out prints were your thing? And like, how does it all happen?
That's the question. When did I figure it out?
I had an artist once go, is that a question? I'm like, yes, it's a question. It's the leading question.
It's the best question. I think for me, I can give you a little rundown of my history. I'll try to do it relatively quickly. I wasn't like a super artistic kid. I mean, I was definitely someone that maybe in my small world was thought of as being creative or thought of as being an artist, but I just had no context for what that meant. And so it mostly meant to me drawing pictures out of Sports Illustrated or something. But I did go to a summer art camp at Wesleyan College when I was in high school.
In Connecticut?
Yeah, in Connecticut.
Oh my gosh.
I think they still have that program. I haven't looked recently, but it was really great. It was like a full summer. And I took a printmaking class there. And I remember this so distinctly. I made a terrible etching of Jim Morrison and an etching of a solvent can. And I don't have those etchings anymore. But those are my first 2 etchings that I made when I was in high school. And then I don't think I thought about it a lot again. But as a biology major at Wake Forest, when I was an undergrad, I took a printmaking class because I knew something about it. And, those science classes were hard.
Easy A.
Yeah, well, I was like, I can take this and I'll have a leg up. So maybe more shot at getting an A to balance out organic chemistry. And that's where I met David Faber and kept taking print classes. And The most influential thing for me, though, to jump to it, was after I had graduated, David had organized a portfolio called the Prairie Music Suite. He invited a whole bunch of really interesting artists, mostly, I guess, from the Midwest, from the prairie of the country in both the United States and in Canada, like the Canadian prairie, and invited them into Wake Forest over the course of a year, kind of one at a time. And they produced editions with the students, like crazy project. At the time, I thought that was like not that crazy. But like now that I'm a teacher and I think about the logistics of organizing that and the work involved in doing that, I would never do that because it would be too hard. It's hard to do one. And we of course have done that, but that's a challenge. But Karen Kuntz was an artist, Warrington Colescott was an artist, Francis Myers was an artist. So many, Derek Besant, Jim Westergaard, Gwen Frank, just these great artists that came in and I got to meet, I got to edition their works with them. And it was specifically working with Warrington Colescott, wiping a plate where I first hand wiped a plate. Of course, I hand wipe all my etching plates now in a particular way. And that was the first time I did it. And working with Gwen Frank, who made these incredibly delicate aquatint layered prints, that's where I first learned how to double drop a plate, or first learned how to print 3 plates and register. And so it was just that experience that not just provided me like this really interesting, I guess technical foundation is one way of putting it, but more like this interest in understanding how a process relates back to an idea, which is, such a big part of printmaking. It was where I first really started thinking about that. But then also just kind of, meeting these artists and interacting with them and getting a sense of their different personalities and what it meant to collaborate, which is, of course, another big part of printmaking. So I had this experience at a pretty early age. I was just out of undergrad. And so instead of going a different route, that's when I decided to commit to being an artist myself and, going off to grad school. And really got into intaglio primarily from there. Has been a medium that I've just done since that time consistently.
The thing that's running through my mind, of course, is this was such a formative moment for you, this working with all of these different artists. And when you said we couldn't possibly do it, I'm like, but that's the thing that hooked you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Give it to someone else, do it again.
Yeah. We do very much try to create those experiences. It is absolutely true as a teacher. You hear a lot about experiential learning today. If you're a teacher, that is something that is being talked about a lot. But of course, experiential learning and what that is has been happening forever, just maybe without a name. But it is that type of learning that really does stick with the students. And, that's always the goal. Like, it's one thing if somebody learns something through some engagement in a classroom that is like a directive from the teacher. But if they're teaching themselves within a structure that engages them with the world, those things are going to stick in a different way. And so you do try to get that into your classes and get that into your curriculum as much as possible. That's the way that at MICA, of course, we have the Dolphin Press entity that has done a lot of great projects with visiting artists, and students have done a lot of great work with those visitors. And we've had, a great time doing those, and we're looking forward to continuing that legacy moving forward. So I totally recognize that is indeed the case. Those are the moments that stick with you. And I am a testament to that.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
The thing that's so hard about it is that, I think Dolphin Press has been pretty quiet in recent years. But if that's the thing that's so good for the students, like, you just want to go beg the, administration to support it because it's such a good tool for you.
Yeah, it has an incredible history. Originally that press, I'm not the perfect person to describe the history in great detail, but that press was originally, really rooted in the letterpress studio and in the creation of broadsides. So there was a lot of collaboration with poets and with writers artists that were creating these text image relationships and building on that broadside history. And we've got that great archive. After I got here, and of course, through Gail's leadership with the press, Gail Deary's leadership, the press became, I believe, more collaborative to different types of artists that were coming in. And, we've done some great projects with some really interesting artists this past decade. We eventually pulled it into a class, and we're running the press through a class, which was really interesting. Eva Wiley, one of my colleagues here, ran a couple of really great classes with some interesting artists. And so, we are figuring out a new formula for Dolphin Press moving forward. And it's for that exact reason. It's so valuable as a teaching, tool or a teaching entity, but also great for the artists that we invite in. Artists love making prints. The thing that I've learned through all the different collaborative printing that I've done is that artists love making prints. All artists, they just love it. Give an artist an opportunity to make prints and they jump on it. So,
yay.
Yeah.
Cheerleader.
Yeah.
Come on in, people.
Yeah.
When I was at the museum years and years ago, 2012, we printed a poster for the Baltimore Museum's print fair because I had somehow convinced Trenton Doyle Hancock to come and be our print fair speaker, which was really great. And so he came a couple of times, and we went down to Globe and pulled all the letterpress out and designed a poster. And it was really fun. We had a great time.
Yeah, I remember that. Of course, that print hangs in our second floor lobby here. Yeah, that was in the old Dolphin building.
Yeah, it was the old Dolphin building.
Feels like forever ago, but I remember that distinctly. I remember working with the students on a Saturday afternoon, trying to pull the large self-portrait portion of that print precisely. And so it's a very distinct memory I have on that project. Seems easy, but it wasn't easy.
Right, exactly.
It never is.
At that point, one of your graduates, Ben Levy, if you've listened to the pod, you know who Ben is. He was working for the museum at that time and had been at the MICA printmaking department for his 4 years. But when we walked in, when they were starting to do the print, he kind of took over. He was like, let's get the gang organized and write out the process. Like, he had that mindset of the collaborative printer and
very, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, Ben, maybe you should sit down.
Yeah, that's funny.
It all worked out. Where did you go to grad school?
So I went to grad school at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and at the time it was the last years of Robert Malone, the printmaker, who I guess fit into the category of like Midwestern printmaker. Think of artists like Warrington Colescott or David Dreisbach and some of those other teaching printmaking artists in the Midwest. And Bob was certainly one of them, and a good person to work with in, the tail end of his career. But that was where my undergraduate professor had gone to college. So I was following David Faber's footsteps there. And it was just a big Midwestern print shop. And
as
just
they
one
all
of those.
are.
Yeah.
There's so many.
Exactly. Yeah. One of those places you go where, you go into the art department and, you expect to see like a sculpture area and a ceramics area or whatnot. And then you just walk in and there's this huge ballroom and it's filled with printmaking equipment. And it's just, what is this all doing here? And sure enough, so it was a good place to go and just work in relative solitude and just kind of develop. I actually spent 4 years in grad school, which sounds crazy, but I took a year off in the middle of my grad school. And then so I was like, and the part of the reason why was when I entered into grad school, I was so raw. Like I had some printmaking classes, but I had hardly had an art history class. I had had any experience in other media. And so it was just a period of like really intense learning for me. And I was just getting my bearing, and, even 4 years probably wasn't enough. But so I had like this extended experience there, and yeah, it was a good place to go.
Playing catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's funny because for the rest of us who, were taking the art classes from the get-go, I can't imagine hopping into it at that stage. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how common that is today. Probably not
I don't
as
know. I don't
common.
know.
I feel like this was in a little bit of a different time. Nonetheless, I had made enough work where they were like, "Oh, okay, you're good enough to come here," even though like I had so little knowledge at the time. So I still feel like I'm playing catch up, but
You do?
a little bit, yeah. I mean, not really, not necessarily because of like that time period, but I always feel like there's just like it's such an endless. I don't know. It's such an endless well, learning more and more.
That that might be one of the other reasons why people are drawn to prints and printmaking because there's always something else you don't know yet. And
Yeah, I think that may be true. And
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, do you want to talk about your work for a little while?
Sure.
My memory is these beautiful 3-plate color gorgeousnesses.
Yeah, I'm very much an artist that has worked with intaglio a great deal. And the most recent work that I'm involved in right now are intaglio pieces. And, you know, a lot of the ideas that I've worked with have been put through that medium. I've done a lot of screen printing as well for different projects. I don't know if we've ever looked at some of my screen printing work
Oh my
together.
God, all the layers. Yes.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
forgotten about those. Yes.
yeah. And I've done a lot of screen printing, and I've also been doing a fair amount of screen printing on canvas recently, which
Oh,
for sure you haven't seen is still in progress. Yeah, so I'm always simultaneously working on some different things. So I'm rarely ever just like, oh, working on this intaglio image or this intaglio project. I've usually got multiple things going just to deal with the different speed that things happen. And so yeah, in that studio space that I feel very lucky because I'm able to, if I do need to do some screen printing, I can do that simultaneous to etching work. I can do that simultaneous to some painting or drawing work or whatever else I'm trying to get into. So it's nice to have that simultaneity possible. So, you know, as I evolved early on, certainly aspects of images that I saw in print history were super interesting to me. So I loved, for example, like incomplete prints. And of
mm-hmm.
course, there's a long history of the incomplete in printmaking. You know, I'll never forget when I was very early on. I shouldn't say I will never forget because I can't even remember exactly when it was. But I'll never forget the experience, just not when exactly it was. But very early on in my career, there was a point where I was working on an intaglio plate and etched a plate and pulled it out of the bath and printed it, and there's fingerprints all over the plate. Of course, you know that happens, etched into the plate, and such a common thing to happen for printmaking. And the thing to do is, okay, what did I do wrong? Like, what's how do I fix this mistake? You can adjust the amount of ground you use. You can adjust how you handle it. You can adjust how you etch the plate. There's all sorts of things you adjust to correct that mistake. But I think one of the things that attracted me to printmaking was this recognition of how valuable that mark was
Mm.
and how that mark, as this indexical mark, in relation to the illusions that I was drawing on the plate, was a little disorienting. You are trying to create this space that creates dimensionality, but then you're immediately pushed back into the recognition that this is just an illusion and this is flat and this is a plate. And not only that, this was created or touched by somebody who's no longer there on a plate that's no longer present. And so
Ooh.
experiencing that and realizing that there's something there was super valuable for me early on because I liked thinking about memory and I liked thinking about my own personal navigation of the world and environment and relationships. And I liked making work about that. And it just seemed like a material and a process that could get into that kind of sensitivity would be valuable. And having that intermediary, having that time and space consideration with that intermediary, recognizing the tension between the flatness of an image and the illusion of an image, something that really captivated me. So a lot of my earliest work, I was really thinking about that space and thinking about like incomplete images. And so I was drawing objects and figures, but only partially. And I think they had an air of kind of mystery to them and an air of uncertainty to them. There was some layering, of course, that I started to incorporate into it. That was the foundation of my work at an early stage. And eventually that evolved into being more explicitly narrative. And not necessarily as like the direction I was heading, but just based on different ideas that I was working with and different things that I wanted to focus on. And yeah, I loved that aspect of printmaking. Of course, there's a huge history of narrative in print and the literary print and storytelling in print. And it's something that I, really appreciate. Although I would say I don't really think of myself as being like a storyteller necessarily. I like relationships between images. And so I like comparison and contrast. I like, the way things might visually interrelate, the way things might conceptually lead into one another, but not necessarily in the creation of the fluid story that is logical. So I do feel like with some of the narrative works or some of the more recent works that are more explicitly narrative in comparison to some of the older works, they are structured differently and they appear different, but they have a kind of an anti-logic to them. Like the logic is not complete. They're a little surreal. They're a little dreamlike. In the earlier prints, there maybe is a stronger tension between the relationship to the flat space and the illusory space. And in the new work, there's a little bit more of a tension just between the different elements within the picture. That's probably a pretty good way of describing it without like looking at the pieces
Well, right.
themselves.
Well, we'll have some images up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Maybe the other thing I would say about some of my early interest in work, of course, I love versions of things. I love variations of things. And that's such a printmaking thing. Once again, to go back to using the intermediary as a device, that's a long, rich history of variations and print making. And I think it's certainly a meaningful area of exploration as we have made this transition between analog and digital, and the way that the meaning of images have shifted so much and become so complex, and the memetics of the world. But, within print, just the ability to create these variations where some of the information stays the same and some of the information disappears, I think that's a really powerful tool as well. And so that's been a foundation of some of the work also. But yeah, I think so. And I forget the year it was, the last time you were in the studio.
Oh, it was probably 2016, if
so
it's 17.
It's been a chunk of time, but I think at that time I was creating like a lot of images in like grids.
They look like comic strips, but they were not linear. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that at least at that time, that those images where I was gridding out little scenes, that led to this portfolio of prints that I made in subsequent years called Signs. And I don't know if you've ever seen that portfolio. It's something for us to maybe look at. But that portfolio explicitly, I think, was about a type of discrete story in which I was really interrelating images consciously. Once again, it wasn't like a fluid story, but it was a kind of a reoccurring character in some different scenes. And there were these visual relationships between the images, and there were these object and subject relationships between the images. Each of the prints in the series interrelated to one another based on certain signs within the subject matter. That project came out of earlier work where I was doing much more extensive gridding out of things. So the gridding was reduced, but still present, and I think a little less comic looking. The work
cool
that you
comic looking. Let me just say.
I mean that positively, but that was the relationship from the work that you had seen into the work that came after. Those drawings that I was putting on the plate that I think do have kind of a comic styling to them, they came from just one of my drawing practices, which is, and I still do this today, and I've been doing this for years, I draw in those type of animation cells. I draw in those grids. So a lot of my drawings that I make when I'm just flowing to get into like a creative space will be in grids. And for some reason, that's just been a tool that's really helped me to get ideas out, as opposed to drawing in a sketchbook or drawing in some other way. Having that grid structure, a part of it is just like, working through an idea, working through a drawing right next to one another and seeing those variations has been really helpful for me. It was just translating that into intaglio and having a lot of fun with that. And then, of course, that was getting matched up with this process of 3-color printing. I was using yellow, red, and blue, much like a comic printing style, but I was not printing the black. And I was just using the combination of the yellow, red, and blue to create the darkest elements of the work. But it's a pretty interesting effect. You get a pretty rich array of secondary and tertiary colors. The fact that there's no black in it is also really interesting. It's like all of the lights and darks are all created just from color mixing. So even the richest areas of the print it really ends up being just like a deep brown if you look at it. And I think it just infuses the work with not only the feeling that it is kind of derived from like a comic aesthetic, but it's something different altogether. And just the fact that they're printed in intaglio is unusual, because necessarily think of like a comic type aesthetic as being put through an intaglio medium.
True enough, yeah.
And one of the things I liked so much about that science portfolio when I made it was that the drawings for that were very quick. A lot of this drawing is very quick. There's 9 prints in that project, and I drew out the entire project over a weekend. Relatively quick drawings, but the project took me 9 months to make. Right. Because each print, once the structure of the print was laid out, the development of it took 2-3 weeks on the plates, and then the printing and the editioning, and then the whole thing took almost a year to finish. But there was something about that ended up being really important to me. Like, I was taking these pieces and these ideas and these drawings, these things that happened very quickly, and then pushing them through this really slow process. So you end up as an artist spending a lot of time with these simple images, and there's a complexity that happens through the development of them. It's quite peculiar to look at those original drawings and the impressions of the plates without the development and think about that time of the initial structure and then the time of the finished print. And so I liked doing that. It was a little anachronistic. It was like I was taking this thing that could just be pushed out into the world very quickly and forcing it through this traditional, slower process that yields something that is subtly unique in its kind of aesthetic potential or aesthetic power. So
I think the grid, I would love to draw in little boxes. Like, that sounds so appealing to me. And I think it, the big open white page is really intimidating. This gives you a little compartment where you can just do something very simple, blocking of form or whatever, and work it through later. It makes total sense to me.
Yeah. And also, when I was younger, so my father worked for a paper company, and he worked for Hammermill Paper Company.
Oh my God.
And he would bring home 8.5 by 11 bond paper.
Bond paper was the best.
Yeah, in a box, basically copy paper. So that's what we just drew on as kids.
Yeah.
And not that that's gridded, but it's small, and importantly, it's not in a sketchbook. So like even today,
whoa, hold on. Wait, I talk to artists about their sketchbooks a lot, and everybody has a different thing about the sketchbook.
Yeah.
Many of whom are like, I don't keep one, and I feel I should, and I feel like I'm a bad artist. Say more about the sketchbook part.
Well, for me, I use sketchbooks, but my sketchbooks are probably like, I don't know, like, I want to say the least interesting thing, but I use them because they're convenient, but the vast majority of like my ideas that come out are just done on bond paper, just like I did when I was a kid. And that's just like ingrained in my system. And so in my studio, I have bins that are just filled with 8.5 by 11 paper where my sketches are. So they're not bound together. And I don't think that's super unusual. I think there's definitely other artists that do the same thing, but it's interesting for me to relate it back to that experience as a kid of just what I had access to and what I became comfortable with. So, yeah, that's my sketching structure.
Yeah, several artists are like, well, I just write in my sketchbook. There are no
Yeah.
images. It's all ideas, written down.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get closer to the idea faster by describing it with text, with words.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of artists have a hard time composing in words.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's true as well. I mean, probably quite common for an artist to say, I'm a visual person, I'm a visual learner. I also think some artists are shockingly good writers.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, that definitely exists.
Yeah.
And there's a reason.
Yeah, I wonder what that connection is. Interesting.
I don't think I'm one of them, but they do exist.
Yeah, for sure. So the work that you're doing now, from what I can tell on your Instagram, is basically black and white. So you've dropped the 3 plates. What happened?
Yeah, good question. 3 plates are really hard.
Okay.
No.
That's totally fair.
No, I think that's not wholly true. It's funny. I think I was working for many, many years with that 3-plate technique of mixing those colors and creating these full color images that had a particular, color feel to them that operated in this way that I liked. But at some point I had a yearning to just create in black and white and try and get as much out of the grayscale as possible. And, I love, of course, noirish prints. I love a beautiful Martin Lewis etching and a Edward Hopper etching, and love the power of the light and dark in those works. And so I started trying to see if I could create the space that I wanted with just a single plate. Part of the thing with working with 3 plates for me is you can correct something on one plate with another plate. And then you can correct that second plate with the third plate. And there's just a way that operates that's quite nice. But it's almost another limiter to be able to be like, oh, I can't use this second or third plate to fix this other thing. And you have to just do it all on this single surface. So it's a little bit of a challenge in a way, that as opposed to being easier to get at the image. So, and it's not uncommon for me to completely redo a plate. I mean, I'm sure that's true of other intaglio artists. I'll spend a good chunk of time on a plate and not be able to get it and not be able to correct it, to have to start over.
So scrap that plate totally.
Yeah, it definitely happens. And it's frustrating when that does happen with intaglio, but I mean, that still happens, of course. And I feel like that happens less when you're working, at least for me, it would happen less when I'm working on multiple plates, because of that ability to like, well, I might not be able to fix it on this plate, but I can fix it on this plate. And the most recent images don't have any of a grid construct to them, but they do have a loose framing to them, which is a continuation of the earlier work. That loose framing is a pretty quick gesture. And I really liked that as a kind of a compositional tool, or as a compositional decision, because I felt like despite the intensity of those images, it gave them a type of ephemeral quality, as if it was a piece of paper you could almost grab and crumple up, or as if it was like floating or something like that. You lose the rigidity of the window and just loosen it a little bit. You let it flow a little bit, and it just becomes something slightly more fleeting. And I liked that quality. At least that's the way that I'm thinking about that structure to those images.
Do you think it makes the paper seem more at one with the image when when you're not that aware of the window like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it just makes the image itself seem a little bit more malleable,
Okay.
like it could just disappear off the page
Okay.
in a way.
Huh.
So I think in all of the different things that I do, I might shift from one idea to the next, and it might change media or it might change certain stylistic things, but there's always like these key carryovers, these key crossovers that I think sometimes I very consciously pull through, and other times it just happens and I don't really notice it till after the fact. But that's one that's been really important with this new work. And the new work, I'm a little bit more explicitly dealing with a cast of characters and specifically pulling out a character that I used in some of the earlier narrative work, like that science portfolio, of like a spirit companion character.
Mm.
I'm very interested in that idea. I'm very interested in the kind of companion concept and think about it in both positive and negative ways, like a representation of perhaps the personification of death, which is certainly a part of that work, as if, it's that companion that carries you through from life to death. But it could also be a personification of an alter ego or a doppelganger. It could be the devil on your shoulder, but it's a character that's in that work that operates across the images. And the landscape itself is a character. There's an animal form that runs through that work that's a character. There's these sculptural elements that become a character. They interrelate in different ways. That's been a lot of fun for me to just play around with across compositions and explore that space of the companion or the spirit entity as a subject.
Right. We always talk about the Patronus. I don't know if you're a Harry Potter fan, but
Mm-mm. I don't know. What is
oh,
that?
well, each of the wizards had a spirit animal that would appear sort of at these key moments in their lives. And Harry, the protagonist, was a white stag, and it turned out that he had, gosh, I haven't read it in so long, but that it was connected to his father who had, died early, blah, blah, blah. But I always joke with True Ludwig about his Patronus is Kate Kolovitz.
Mm.
And that's the spirit of all of the work he tries to do in his own artwork. And yeah,
Yeah, that
and
makes
so
sense.
yeah, I always think of the Patronus. That's what it sounds like you're talking
Yeah,
about.
maybe a little. I mean, there's so many different ways to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and every culture has their own version of it, right?
It's exactly right. Yeah, and I think that's one
Yeah.
of the things that's so interesting. I'm very interested in this description of the passage from life to death as well, and in relation to the spirit companion. And I'm maybe thinking about the entities as a type of benevolent figure, or the question of whether the entity is benevolent, like a psychopomp, or whether it's the thing that actually kills you, whether it's negative, and the tension between that. That actually is another aspect I think that does carry through a lot of my work. I think there is often a tension within the narrative about what exactly is happening. And generally, roughly, you could say, oh, is this a positive description of this engagement, or is it something quite negative? And so I like thinking about that in the context of this kind of familiar spirit.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, because transitioning to death it's not always a negative thing, right? If you've lived a long life and you know
Yeah,
what I mean?
but even like in the visualization of it, even within like the history of art and the personification of death and the history of art and film, and it often plays this dual role.
Yes, right.
It is the thing that eases the process. It's not the cause, or it can be the cause quite literally, and that
Right.
is the space that you can play around with a little bit.
Huh.
And I ultimately think that the works have an optimism to them, but at the same time, There's a skeleton figure, there's a Grim Reaper figure, and there's pain in there that is being described, or there's potentially a painful experience in there that's being described. But
well, that's just everyone's fear, right? It's
yeah,
all fear.
I
Yeah,
mean, I
that it's
think
going
that's
to hurt or.
a good way of putting it.
I mean, I think everyone's afraid to die, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm not thinking about death at a personal level. And so I agree with you that, of course, as you get older, you start thinking of those end of life issues in your own personal circumstances or in your family circumstances. And that certainly becomes more present. And maybe that is playing a role more so than what I'm consciously thinking about. But I mean, I do think that one of the realities of our contemporary media landscape is a lot more exposure to death.
mm,
And that's a complicated issue. I think that might also just play a role in my thinking on this. But ultimately, like I was saying, I actually quite think of these images as being a continuation of the narratives within my work that have to do with the choices that we make over the course of life, and the decisions that we make, and where that leads us, and the signs that we look for to make these decisions, ultimately, where that leaves us at the very, very end.
putting all that into a visual form is that's a lofty,
I would also
lofty
say
goal.
this is for sure. But I would also say that, I'm like in the middle of this right now. So I don't have all of the ideas worked through, but yeah, that's the territory with
Whoa.
this work. And the other part of it that I think is actually quite important is that I commonly am working with imagery that is, not to overuse the word, but narrative or descriptive, but I'm commonly pairing it with imagery that you would describe as being like abstract or non-objective even. But oftentimes there's relationships. I mean, sometimes those relationships are quite obvious. All of these pieces that I'm making that describe these scenes with these characters, they're part of a portfolio that are paired with these, I guess what I think of as language pieces, but they're these geometric abstractions that are very, very richly colored in a very particular way. The way that I'm thinking about these in relation to the subject of the spirit companion is I'm thinking about it like a type of language that has a technological component to them. Like they're kind of futuristic, indecipherable as this futuristic language, representing this unknown space, which would be what happens after you die. So they're companion pieces, these narrative works and these abstract works, and they go together, hoping I can fully work through that.
I mean, it's a fully formed idea for a large body of work.
Mm-hmm.
Did you wake up in the morning and go, I've got the idea, where to, don't let it go? Or is it just sort of a slow, how do you
Yeah,
come up with it?
that's such a good question, because I would say for me, the vast majority of what I do, I discover through the making. And yeah,
The meaning follows the making?
well, it's messy, but for me, I'm not someone that does a lot of upfront research and then executes an idea. I'm someone that I have to make. I think printmaking is a great process for being that type of artist, because there is all this interesting time and space working on the matrix, and there's so many different points where creativity and change with your ideas can happen in a process. But especially with a body of work, I'm definitely someone that pulls out meaning throughout the course of what I'm doing. And I do feel like I've been pretty fortunate with the different projects that I've done, where like I've been able to reflect either back on the project or the things that I've made over the course of a project, and pulled things out that made a lot of sense. I do feel like I've made things that just ultimately I couldn't wrap my head around in terms of why I made them, and maybe they get scuttled or whatever. The vast majority of what I'm doing, it's definitely through the process of making. But I do think I work hard throughout that process to put definition to it. And yeah, that's generally how I would describe what happens to me. And it's very true, I think, with this most recent project, although I'm about finished with it, I fully expect a lot of how it's functioning and how I think about it and talk about it and write about it won't happen until I'm completely done. So,
yeah.
Which I also don't think is too terribly unusual.
No, I think you're right. Yes, I've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, it wasn't until 15 years later. I was like, oh, that's what
right,
I was
exactly.
doing.
Yeah. But, you know, there is something about, I think that gets into the conversation of, as artists, we want to trust our impulses. That's one of the big challenges. I mean, sometimes I feel very confident in my impulses, but then you go through stretches where you stop believing in your impulses. And I think a part of being a successful artist is to be able to fight through those stretches of time where your impulse isn't functioning the way that you want it to. And of course, you have to figure out the different strategies to break through that. I wish I knew what they all were, but we're all searching for those strategies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to just ask one last question before we wrap up, which will require you to put on your professor hat for a minute.
Okay.
So leaving your work behind, I love talking to people about how they go about looking at a work of art fresh to them and expressing something smart to the artist in a critique. Do you know what your process is?
My process for critique?
Well, yeah, like if you walked in cold and you saw my thing on the wall, how long does it take you to come up with something constructive? It's hard. It's so hard.
It is hard. It's definitely a skill that you get better at with time. But the other part of the reality of that is I don't think any critic or any person that is looking at something and providing critical feedback is going to be great for everyone. And I think you have to know that as a teacher. I mean, there's times when you might walk in cold to a project and it might not, it's just like when you're making art. We just had this conversation about how meaning is derived over time, the course of the project. But it's the same thing. And a lot of times something comes through much later and it's too late to relay that depending on the circumstance. But yeah, I mean, I think that certainly within a print context, as you might be working through what the intention of the artist is, you know, you can often enter into that project through the print itself and through the construction of that print itself and try to probe that relationship between that construction and the ideas that you're trying to make out or that you feel as if the artist is trying to make out. So, you know, I think that I would generally ask questions of the artist about that relationship between the thing that we're looking at and their idea, as opposed to just the idea itself or as opposed to just the process itself, and see if through that kind of relationship discussion you can't tug out like other entry points for deeper conversation. And I don't know if that's like a strategy necessarily, but I do think that's something that I try and do in the critique process.
Well, it's a good starting point for sure. Yeah. Because I feel like I'm less able to have constructive, technical, you know, objecty. Like I can appreciate form and composition and all that stuff, but the technical part, I'm the idea person, I guess. I don't know. It's weird. It's hard.
You think about your critique abilities as being stronger when not having to like delve into the technical stuff. You want to get in there and talk about the ideas, and if the ideas are not functioning well, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly can appreciate, you know, using etching versus screen for a certain kind of work or something, and I can certainly talk about that. But when I'm walking around, you know, and I hear other teachers, like in a big, you know, like True has this end of the semester critique thing, and I go and I listen to all the faculty that are there, and they're having these discussions with the kids, and I'm like, I like it. Which
That's
paper do
often
you like
just what
better?
that's often just what I think as well. I mean, sometimes that's the right thing, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, the thing, of course, we're fortunate at MICA because we do have a lot of really thoughtful students here, and these are young artists that are exploring ideas, and it's very difficult just cold looking at a single piece to necessarily tap into that. As a teacher, you usually have some context, and that really allows you to like get into whatever subject they're thinking about, and you can challenge them and try and get them, thinking more critically themselves. But I totally agree. Like, I don't know how great of a cold critiquer I am.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And so it's good. I mean, the fact that you're being self-critical yourself about this is probably quite good. I actually do love it, though. I love that cold. I do like that. That's kind of a fun thing to just challenge yourself with. I don't know about
Yeah.
strategy, though, but it's fun to do.
I always talk about my system of I have questions that attack the emotional content versus the visual content. And they're running through my head at a quite rapid rate. And then I've got a slide projector going of every artist that kid should look at as they're, that's where my brain goes. But like Ben would say, I have the structure and I'm reverse engineering how they did it and every decision they made. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah, I actually try not to do that. I think that's totally a valid approach. And I think that's an important part of the conversation. And certainly, depending on the idea, it might be the conversation. Part of the reason why people love prints is because they love, of course, trying to figure out how the print was made.
Sure.
And so there's that. That's the thing I think you do want to kind of bring into the conversation over time as you are trying to pull out of the student the reason they're making the decisions that they're making, and start broad and get more specific as you go along in the conversation. And like I said, if you can find a relationship between that process, between that construction, between those material decisions, between the formal decisions, and the imagery that they're working with and the emotions that they're digging into, then yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, I do enjoy it, but sometimes I'm like, I got nothing.
Well, that's good though. That's one of the reasons why I like having you come visit, because I feel like you are very, you're very honest with the students. Good.
I've only made a couple of kids cry.
I think I've only made one in my time.
Oh, that's good. Wow.
Yeah. And see, you remember when that happens, you're like, oh, I don't really want that to be happening right now.
No, but
Yeah.
and sometimes, like, I had a boss accuse me of not really knowing how strongly I can come across, and because I'm in my own head, I'm like, surely not, right? But I was talking to one of your students from several years ago, Leo Zhao. He had this really wonderful print up, and I thought it was super cool. And I apparently said, I don't remember saying it. I said to him, I want to see more of you. I want to see more personal. Like, it's cool that they're this thing, but I'm missing you. And he never forgot it. And I felt so bad. I was like, oh, wait, it wasn't supposed to be that.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a good example, though, of like, that's such a valid critique, even independent of like the specificity here. But I mean, that is a critique that I often commonly would give as well to work. And I think, totally a valid thing to say, but different students have different sensitivities with critique, right. That's for sure. And so you do have to be thoughtful about that. But all things considered, like the way critique used to be was vastly different. I feel like the critique space has changed a lot. I feel like it's generally like more constructive and productive and positive, where I think just in academia in general, I think it used to be much harsher, just in general, for better or for worse. So, yeah.
Yeah, you can make a case for both ways, right?
Yeah.
No. Oh, God. Anyway, Jonathan, thank you for talking to me today. I enjoyed our conversation so much.
Yeah, likewise. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, Before we hang up, though, I also want to say that by the time this episode comes out, people, the print fair in Brooklyn will already have happened, but Jonathan will be there. And I'm so excited to have you there amongst all of your compadres. I think it's going to be so cool.
Yeah, I am so totally looking forward to it. And, I'm finishing up this most recent project to have at that fair. And yeah, thank you so much for all that work yeah, just,
it's a lot.
yeah, the value to the print ecosystem, as I'd say, is so great. And, but excited to be just a part of it. And yeah, really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. I'm connected with a bunch of you guys on the Instagrams, and I'm watching everybody try and finish up these projects before the fair. I'm like, yes, do it.
Yeah.
Everyone needs a deadline.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, all right. Well, thank you again. It's been great.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this episode with Jonathan Thomas. He's a delight, and I love both his work and his working ethos. Thank you to Jonathan for being a great guest. Thank you, Jonathan. And also, as usual, I have to thank several people. One, Dan Fury of Extension Audio for being my sound guy. Thanks, Dan. And also Uncle Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. And lastly, one to Skip Barnhart and Lee Turner, who sent me sounds from their studios that I use at the top and bottom of every episode. Images are over on the website, platemarkpodcast.com, and also over there you can do a couple of things. One would help me out a lot, which is to answer the listener survey. That will help me guide the direction of the pod in the future, and also you could hit support and donate and help me keep the lights on. It's a labor of love. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. All right, I think that's it. We'll see you next time.